Mistake. Why did aid restart only a few days later?
Again, we would take complete issue with what would some call reporting and others call a hatchet job.
So why did aid start just a couple days later?
I'm saying the reporting is inaccurate, ma'am.
They never thought it would come to this. In a stunning turn of events, Pete Hegseth has been removed from Congress, an outcome no one saw coming. The shocking revelation came after Representative Mikie Sherrill exposed what she claims is the truth that changes everything. The halls of power are shaken, supporters are stunned, and the country is left asking, how could this happen?
You're an embarrassment to the United States. If Russia invades NATO allies, I have called for your resignation. I didn't think you were qualified before your confirmation, and you have done nothing to inspire confidence in your ability to lead competently.
Imagine you are a soldier serving on the front lines in Ukraine. You are waiting for critical supplies from the United States, equipment you need to prepare for the next Russian assault. The aid is already on its way, but suddenly, without warning, it is pulled back. Not because of a Russian strike, not because of logistics or bad weather, but because of a misunderstanding at the highest level of government. In Washington, the Secretary of Defense interpreted the president's words as a direct order to stop aid and acted on it immediately. For soldiers relying on that equipment, the result was not just an inconvenience, but potentially a matter of life and death. This is a situation that played out under the leadership of Pete Hegseth, who served as Secretary of Defense. The events became a central issue during a recent hearing in Congress, where Representative Mikie Sherrill challenged him directly on his record and performance. Her criticism was not broad or vague. It was specific, detailed, and aimed squarely at his ability to manage one of the most important departments in the U.S. government. We began with what she described as operational incompetence. According to news reports, during Hegseth's first week in office, he attended a meeting of the National Security Council. In that meeting, President Donald Trump was discussing foreign aid, and Hegseth understood his remarks as an instruction to stop military assistance to Ukraine. Instead of seeking clarification, as most seasoned officials would in such a situation, Hegseth acted immediately. He gave the order to halt shipments, and supplies that were already on their way to Ukraine were turned back. The abrupt reversal cost the United States millions of dollars and deprived Ukrainian soldiers of weapons and equipment they were counting on to defend themselves against Russia. Days later, the decision was undone, and the aid resumed, but by then, the damage had already been done. Representative Sherrill pressed him on how such a misunderstanding could have occurred. She pointed out that a functioning administration depends on clear communication, and when there is uncertainty, leaders are expected to seek clarification before making a decision that has such serious consequences. Her point was simple. In the nerve center of the world's most powerful military, one cannot afford to misinterpret instructions that carry implications for war and peace. She demanded an explanation for how such an error took place. Hegseth responded by dismissing the reports as inaccurate. He referred to them as fake news, arguing that journalists often speculate about matters they do not understand. He maintained that the claims were part of an effort to criticize both him and President Trump unfairly. When Sherrill followed up, noting that the aid did indeed resume just days later, he again denied the accuracy of the reporting. His answers were evasive, focusing on questioning the legitimacy of the press rather than addressing the substance of her question. The exchange revealed a sharp divide. On one side was the representative citing reports, timelines, and outcomes that were publicly documented. On the other side was the secretary insisting the accounts were false without offering a clear alternative explanation. This back and forth left viewers with an impression of a government official unwilling to acknowledge mistakes, even when the consequences were obvious and verifiable. What makes this issue especially important is the broader context. Military aid to Ukraine has been one of the most sensitive and closely watched areas of U.S. foreign policy in recent years. The war with Russia has placed extraordinary pressure on Ukraine, and Western support has often been the difference between holding ground and losing it. Interruptions in aid shipments, even for a few days, can weaken Ukraine's ability to defend itself and send a damaging signal to allies and adversaries alike. At a time when consistency and reliability are crucial, even the perception of confusion in Washington can have ripple effects across Europe and beyond. Operational competence is one of the most basic expectations for a defense secretary. It means ensuring that orders are understood clearly, that communication within the department and with the White House is precise, and that decisions are made based on accurate information. When this breaks down, as Representative Sherrill argued it did, the risks are not abstract. They affect soldiers on the battlefield, alliances with partners, and the credibility of the United States as a global leader. In the hearing, Sherrill went further, pointing out that this was not just a one-off error, but part of a broader pattern. She argued that under Hegseth's leadership, the Pentagon had descended into chaos. With decisions made hastily or without clear justification, she highlighted his tendency to package complex failures into simple catchphrases, pointing to slogans like restoring the warrior ethos and increasing lethality. In her view, these slogans masked dysfunction rather than solving it. Instead of a steady hand guiding the department, she described leadership that was reactive, careless, and prone to mistakes. This framing resonated with many who have observed the Pentagon in recent years. Managing the Department of Defense is not just about strategic vision. It is about the execution of decisions at every level. A secretary who does not pay attention to details or who fails to clarify presidential orders can inadvertently set off a chain of consequences that reach far beyond Washington. In this case, the miscommunication about aid to Ukraine underscored the risks of inexperience and poor judgment. Hegseth's dismissal of the allegations did little to address these concerns. By calling them fake news, he avoided direct engagement with the facts. For lawmakers, journalists, and military personnel who had followed the timeline of events, his refusal to acknowledge even the possibility of error raised additional questions about accountability. In democratic governance, particularly in matters of defense, accountability is not optional. Leaders are expected to answer difficult questions, acknowledge mistakes when they occur, and explain how they will prevent them from happening again. The controversy over the halted aid also tied into broader political debates about the role of the United States in supporting Ukraine. Within Washington, there has been disagreement about the level of aid, the speed of delivery, and the long-term commitments involved. Some argue that the U.S. has done too much, risking escalation with Russia, while others believe it has not done enough, leaving Ukraine vulnerable. Against this backdrop, a misstep by the Secretary of Defense becomes more than just an administrative problem. It becomes a flashpoint in a larger struggle over policy and strategy. Less than a month into his tenure, Hegseth made a decision that shocked many in Washington and across the armed forces. He dismissed General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the chief of naval operations. Both were respected officers with long records of service. They were not accused of misconduct, nor were there clear policy disagreements that justified their removal. Hegseth never provided a detailed public explanation for why he chose to fire them. To this day, critics argue that the dismissals weakened stability within the Pentagon and created a vacuum of leadership at a crucial moment. Representative Sherrill pressed him directly on this point. She suggested that Brown was targeted because he was black and that Franchetti was dismissed because she was a woman. She acknowledged that Hegseth might contest that interpretation, but she noted the lack of alternative explanations. In her view, the absence of transparency reinforced suspicions that the firings were not based on performance, but on prejudice or political considerations. The consequences of these decisions were not limited to the individuals involved. Months later, the Pentagon still lacked nominees for some of the top leadership positions. According to media reports at the time, qualified admirals declined to be considered for the role of Chief of Naval Operations, worried about instability and politicization at the top. If true, this was a remarkable and troubling development. The U.S. Navy, central to America's ability to project power globally, was effectively left in limbo. Without permanent leadership, the service faced difficulties in planning, budgeting, and implementing long-term strategies. It also sent a message to allies and adversaries alike that U.S. defense leadership was fractured. When Sherrill asked Hegseth when Congress would receive a nomination for the next Chief of Naval Operations, he deflected. He advised her not to believe everything reported in the press and insisted that no admiral had formally declined the position. He promised that a nomination would come in due time, but did not provide a date or a plan. His answers only deepened her argument that the Pentagon under his leadership was marked by delay, confusion, and a lack of accountability. This exchange illustrated the importance of managerial competence in government. Running the Department of Defense is not just about setting military strategy. It is about managing one of the largest organizations in the world, with more than 2 million personnel and a budget in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Stability at the top is critical. Senior military leaders provide continuity across administrations, ensure that policies are implemented effectively, and give professional advice grounded in decades of experience. When those leaders are removed abruptly or left without replacements, the institution itself suffers. For soldiers and sailors on the ground, the effects may not be immediately visible, but they are real. Leadership gaps can slow decision-making, delay procurement, and create uncertainty about priorities. Within the military, morale is tied closely to confidence and leadership. When top officials are dismissed without cause, it can send a message that loyalty or politics matter more than competence. For an organization built on trust, discipline, and professionalism, that is corrosive. After focusing on managerial issues, Representative Sherrill turned to what she described as budgetary incompetence. This was the third major area where she argued that Hegseth had failed. Her concerns were both procedural and substantive. Procedurally, she noted that the Department of Defense had missed the deadline to submit a draft defense budget to Congress. This may sound technical, but it carries significant consequences. Congress cannot finalize the National Defense Authorization Act or appropriations bills without that draft. A missed deadline delays the entire process, making it harder to plan for acquisitions, training, and operations. In practical terms, it means the armed forces may not receive funding on time for critical needs. Substantially, Sherrill accused Hegseth of wasting money on poorly conceived projects and vanity initiatives. She listed several examples. Retrofitting a Qatari jet to serve as Air Force One would cost about $400 million. A planned military parade in Washington was estimated at over $40 million. A bombing campaign in Yemen cost about $1 billion. Yet, weeks later, missile strikes continued in Israel, raising questions about effective operations in Los Angeles, which were not clearly defined, would cost tens of millions more. In her view, these projects drained resources from more pressing priorities, such as countering China, which she identified as the most significant long-term threat. When she asked Hegseth directly what priorities had been cut to pay for these projects, he again deflected. He mentioned securing the southern border, but did not provide specifics about which programs had lost funding. He insisted that trade-offs are made every day and that his department was proud of the changes reflected in the budget. For Sherrill, and for others listening, this was not a satisfactory answer. The expectation was transparency about how taxpayer dollars were being spent, especially when the stakes involved national security. Budgetary decisions are not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. They reflect priorities, values, and strategic thinking. A dollar spent on a parade is a dollar not spent on cyber defense, missile systems, or modernizing the fleet. For Congress, which has the constitutional responsibility to oversee spending, vague answers and delays raise red flags. When the defense secretary cannot explain clearly how resources are allocated, it undermines confidence in the department's management. The broader concern raised by Sherrill was that under Hegseth's leadership, the Pentagon was not acting as a disciplined, well-run institution, but rather as an extension of political theater. She argued that decisions about firings, budgets, and operations seemed more about short-term optics than about long-term national security. Her questions were designed to show that incompetence in operations, management, and budgeting are not separate problems. They are connected, and together they paint a picture of dysfunction. The hearing also underscored the role of oversight in a democratic system. Members of Congress are tasked with holding the executive branch accountable. When a Secretary of Defense appears before them, they are expected to provide clear answers, defend their decisions, and acknowledge mistakes when appropriate. The sharpness of Sherrill's questioning reflected frustration not only with the decisions themselves, but also with the evasive style of Hegseth's responses. Instead of addressing specific concerns, he questioned the legitimacy of reporting, deflected responsibility, and leaned on slogans. For lawmakers trying to ensure effective defense policy, this was not enough.